I'm very intrigued by Second Life, very interested in the concept of a virtual world. I suppose you could say that the creators of Second Life, the conceivers and programmers, have in a way acted in a godlike way. I mean, they have made a world in which people can live, and that is godlike. You could imagine a science fiction novel in which we, the real world, you and me, actually live. It turns out we discover that we are actually living in a second life that's been created by some alien intelligence, some superhuman intelligence on another planet, perhaps, if indeed another planet means anything in the context of this discussion. So we are the computer simulation of an alien intelligence. That is the, quote, God that has created us. Well, it's an intriguing thought, and it's hard to disprove. But would that intelligence really be a God? That's the question that is interesting me now. Would that intelligence really be a God? And I want to say no, it wouldn't. It would have all the attributes of a God. It would be of gigantic intelligence. It would know huge amounts more about the laws of physics than we ever could know. It would be capable of feats that we could only dream of. And so in all sorts of respects, we would want to call it a God. We would want to perhaps worship it as a God. But it wouldn't be a God in the following very important sense. This alien intelligence would itself have had to have evolved by something like the same slow, gradual, incremental process as we evolved by, as in the real world, Darwinian natural selection. So gods, in my definition, are not just superhuman, godlike beings. They would have to be beings that, say, are eternal, beings that existed before the universe began and created the universe. And that is the one kind of God which I believe we can more or less rule out on grounds of probability. Chapter 4 of The God Delusion explains this, so I won't go into it. But the argument essentially is that any godlike being capable of creating a universe would have to be the sort of complicated being that requires an explanation, which is the very kind of explanation that Darwinian science can give it. When Darwinian scientists explain the origin and evolution of life, what we're doing is explaining the arising of organized complexity and intelligence and the capacity to design. We're explaining how that arises from very simple beginnings, by slow, gradual steps, by slowly mounting a staircase. I call it in another book, climbing Mount Improbable. And every step of the way is explicable, is understandable. At no stage do you have to resort to magic. At no stage do you have to resort to the supernatural. And so I'm fully prepared to believe that there are godlike beings elsewhere in the universe, but they will have evolved elsewhere in the universe. They will have started from simple beginnings, perhaps by Darwinian selection, perhaps by some other incremental crane, as the philosopher Dan Dennett calls it, some kind of process that really does explain how you get from simplicity, which we can all understand, to complexity, which demands an explanation. So don't confuse godlike beings with gods. True gods that are worth worshipping, are worth praying to, etc., true gods come about by some, or don't come about, perhaps are eternally there, outside time, something like that, and create the universe. Aliens from outer space, no matter how wonderful and grand and great their intelligence, even if they're capable of creating a second life in which of which we are all a part, aliens from outer space would have to be evolved by an explicable process analogous to Darwinian natural selection. I first encountered the idea of virtual worlds in which people could go and live like Second Life. This was before Second Life was invented, but I went to a conference in which people talked about it. I was fascinated by it. I am intrigued by the idea of creating a world in which a mirror of life, or a second life can go on. You can experimentally, for example, create new kinds of physics. You could imagine having a second life in which you simulate the physics of the moon, where gravity is a small fraction of Earth's gravity and where people can jump over houses. There's no reason why you have to constrain this virtual world, this simulated world, to the physics of Earth. You could vary it in interesting ways. You could fly, and I'm sure people do. I haven't actually spent very much time in these virtual worlds. I find them a bit clunky at the moment. I find that we need a few more years of Moore's law, whereby computer achievement, computer power, doubles every 18 months, and that's a remarkably fast exponential rate of growth. A few more years of Moore's law, and the virtual worlds such as Second Life are going to look really very realistic. And the avatars are going to look like real people. I could imagine having virtual sex in Second Life, for example, which might be very interesting. So I'm looking forward to some progress in the technology. I'm glad that people are already doing Second Life, because the technology improvements won't happen unless the first steps are taken. I think another step might be that instead of just sitting in front of an ordinary computer screen and looking at the two-dimensional computer screen, we might in the future wear those, something like the goggles which virtual reality labs use, where you are, because you've got separate input to the two eyes, the computer can simulate a 3D world much more realistically. And also, when you turn your head or when you move other bits of yourself, this reflects itself in what you see. So in existing virtual reality labs, when you turn your head to the left, the computer picks up the fact that you've turned your head to the left, and the whole visual field that you're looking at moves in an appropriate way. I suppose another step might be to wear, I was thinking aloud and I don't know how much progress has been made, but some kind of body stocking which picks up the movements of your limbs, so that when you actually move your hand, I think I've already seen it done with a glove, but you perhaps generalize the glove principle. When you move your whole body, it could move the avatar's body in virtual space in interesting, well, in reflective ways. When the time comes that it becomes difficult to tell the difference between the virtual world of a second life, or a third, fourth or fifth life, I suppose by then, and what we call reality, then it's an interesting thought that people might actually start to suffer delusions and genuinely be unable to tell the difference between the reality and the virtual world in which they have immersed themselves. I think there's something to be said for the view that in our real world, nothing to do with computers now, in our real world, what we actually see is not a photographic representation of what our eyes give us. It's not as though the retinas of the eyes are two cinema screens that give us a kind of faithful readout of what's out there in the real world, but rather that our brain constructs a kind of virtual reality. That's what we already do. I mean, when I look at an object, when I look at a person, maybe what I'm seeing is best regarded as a piece of virtual reality simulated in my own brain, using the input from the eyes and the ears and the nose, etc., using the input from the sense organs to update the virtual reality that my own brain is simulating. And I think if you look at the sort of visual illusions that psychologists study, things like the Necker cube, if you look at visual illusions, what you see when you see the illusion is best interpreted as a result of the fact that what we're doing in our brain is simulating a controlled virtual reality, a virtual reality which is continuously updated by sensory input from the real world.